and welcome back to my channel, where I'm going to cover the Sorcerer's Shadow Magic class specialization from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, providing a brief description of the subclass, as well as explain and set up the various features gained. A Shadow Magic character has the ability to make use of those darker magics that come from the Shadowfell, as that's where their power is rooted. As a result, it can manifest into physically unique characteristics that might affect your character, and to see some examples, you can make use of the Shadow Sorcerer quirks table and use them directly or for inspiration to create your own ideas. As your character is kind of essentially linked to the Shadowfell, your character will also gain many abilities that would normally only be seen within the Shadowfell itself. As sorcerers choose their class specialization at level 1, the links to the Shadowfell must be closely thought out, because unless the campaign itself is taking place in the Shadowfell or during the return of the Nethril Empire in the Forgotten Realms, this magic would have a hard time getting out of the Shadowfell due to the barriers put into place to protect other worlds from the sinister magic. It does not mean it's impossible, but it will be highly unlikely that this kind of magic would have leaked out of the Shadowfell outside of some very specific events that have occurred in relation to that world. It is still possible, however, that your character could have been born after that series of events, and as a result may have been born with some of that shadow magic in them because maybe one or more of their parents are from the Shadowfell even though you were raised in a different world. In any event, the DM must be consulted to ensure that they are going to be okay with the concepts that you have come up with for your character in order to be able to acquire access to this magic. So for our example, let me go quickly create a level 1 character so that we can move into the various features that your character is going to gain, and as I'm about to select the class specialization, I will bring everything back up on the screen so that you can see it. So at this particular point, I am ready to go ahead and select my class specialization, and once again, as soon as I selected Sorcerer, it popped up this class specialization selection down here at the bottom. I want to ensure that I select Shadow Magic in this particular case. The first feature your character will gain is called Eyes of the Dark, and it's going to give your character dark vision with a range of 120 feet initially. But as you gain additional levels, up to level 3, your character will gain some additional capabilities. In the event your character already has dark vision, then the range will be increased to match the new distance if it's longer than what your character can already natively see. However, if your character has True Sight, then you will essentially have True Sight up to the distance you can see with that, but then after that, see with the native dark vision out to the 120 foot reach. At 3rd level, your character will be able to learn the darkness spell, and will be able to use it via a spell slot or by expending 2 sorcery points. And when the sorcery points are used to cast the spell, your character will be able to see through that darkness spell as if you had used True Sight, but not if you had simply cast it through the spell slot. Now, typically, when you go and modify a character, if they already have a sense here that is True Sight or Dark Vision or whatever, you would simply, in the case of just being Dark Vision here, increase its range if it needs to be increased. But because this character has no sense capabilities, no True Sight or anything like that, we want to just simply go ahead and add Dark Vision here and say 120 feet. Now when your character is on the map, they will be able to see for 120 feet, but there is another way that you can do this if you don't want to put it here, or you have another sense that is technically a higher tier than what dark vision is, i.e. True Sight. What you can do in that case is add this particular feature to your Actions tab, we'll call it Shadow Magic for the group, and then you can create a new effect, and this is going to be a vision-based effect. And essentially it's called Eyes of the Dark, semicolon, a vision, which is all in capital letters, with a colon, and then 120 dark vision. And there's a space between the 120 and the dark vision. So it's the range, then the type of vision, not the other way around. This is also not going to expire, and it's a permanent modification to your character. You're not expending any use of a feature to gain access to this particular vision capability. When you go through and use it, though, that's going to require a little bit of a different thing. So once your character is added to the combat tracker here, what you can go ahead and do is simply click this effect. And I should have actually applied it so that it goes on yourself because it's only going to be on your own character. So that's a slight modification to that particular effect. But clicking this will automatically add this to your character. And it will override anything that is here if it's a lower tier vision, which in this case, let's say it's dark vision 30 foot. Now you can see out to 120 feet and it will override what's here. But if it is True Sight, it should not override the True Sight capability that you have here. and your range for True Sight should stay, but once you get past that range, then the dark vision range will come into place. This is permanent. This can stay on your character the entire time that you're in the combat tracker, and anytime you're dropped onto the map because of that, it will automatically show up. And I will talk about the darkness spell once we actually get our character up to level 3, because it's most applicable to there, because at this point you should have your sorcery point set up, and I'm going to go through and show you how that should work. Also at Sorcerer level 1, your character will gain the Strength of the Grave feature, which gives you the means to attempt to stave off death if your character is reduced to 0 hit points. However, the damage that was applied to your character cannot be radiant damage or critical damage in order for you to be able to make use of this particular feature. Once your character is hit with enough damage to take you at or below 0 hit points, you can make a charisma-based saving throw and attempt to simply drop to 1 hit point instead. The DC check is a minimum of 5 plus the total number of hit points your character took for damage. For example, if your character was hit for 10 points of damage, your character would need to roll a 15 or higher to simply drop to 1 hit point. However, if your character was hit for 30 hit points of damage, your character would have to roll a 35 or higher in order to make that save. That is not possible at this early stage in the game, but it could theoretically be possible at later stages in the game, depending on how well you statted your character. And just to caution you, if you think a 1 or a 20 on a d20 roll during a saving throw is a critical fail or a critical hit, or a save I should say, that is actually in fact not the case. It is simply a 1 or a 20 plus whatever your modifier is going to be on top of that. And I am unaware of any rule that makes them so other than a DM's own house rule. So there may be some DMs that play it that way, but generally most DMs won't. This feature can only be used once before your character will need to complete a long rest in order to regain any spent uses. So we're going to have to make sure that we track the number of times we use this feature. So let's go ahead and quickly add this to our character sheet. So I'm going to also move this into the Shadow Magic group, and I'm simply going to set it up to be a preparation of 1 daily use. Yeah, it's a long rest. That way, if we use it, we can go ahead and set that up. Now, generally you don't set up a saving throw here. The way you would run this is that you would simply roll a charisma-based saving throw and compare that against the total number of hit points that you were actually hit by. So how this is going to work is going to be as follows. I'm going to have the vampire go ahead and hit our character. Now our character's at 8 hit points total. That's their total level. This is a level 10 vampire. It's going to hurt. And I'm going to move our combat token to the vampire. Make our attack roll. That is going to be a critical hit, so I'm going to roll damage. Wow. First I roll a 20 in a previous video. Now I'm rolling snake eyes here. This sorcerer is good. They just survived the damage from a vampire. Although for some reason it didn't get applied to our character because for some reason I didn't target our character. Interesting. All right, hang on. That was a hit, so I'm going to drop this onto our character here. There we go. So that's the damage that our character hit. But let's say that our vampire hit a second time and rolls again for the damage. Now our character is unconscious. But at this particular point in time, you could simply go and do this. Make your saving throw because you had an 8 for the total amount of damage. That's what you were hit with. So you add 5 to 8, which is 13. In this case, you would save, which means your character would actually simply be reduced to 1 hit point left. So you've suffered 7 wounds and your character's not unconscious, which you can't modify. The DM has to do that. That's one example as to how that's going to work, but I may have found a better way to simplify the math requirement. You will still have to manually figure out what 5 plus the total amount of damage is going to be. In this particular case, it's going to be a 13. And then simply modify a cast effect here, if you will, to have a fixed roll against your charisma of 13. What this will do is you simply take this and drag that onto your character, and it will tell you succinctly whether you succeeded or whether you failed. Let's see if I can get a failure here on 13. That's still a success. This will be a failure. So you can see here that it's indicating a failure. That will tell you right off as to whether your character remains at the 1 hit point or whether it goes below 0 and you fall unconscious. So there's now chat representation to indicate why you were making a saving throw, as well as why you succeeded and are still around, or failed and finally went unconscious. I think that's a better way to do it. And I like this way. All you really have to do is ensure that you modify this value manually before you execute the roll, which is why I have this set for a fixed roll. I don't know of any other convenient way that you can go 5 plus this, roll against that, and away you go. Now, before I move on to the next feature, the way that I added this is I simply right-clicked, added an action, and then added a cast here. What that gave me was this window, and then I simply set this to a charisma type for the saving throw, set this to fixed for its base value, so there are 3 states here, and then set the bonus to 13. That way, it will be against a value of 13, you make your charisma check, and away you go. So you now have the ability to drag this onto your character and have the system figure out whether you succeeded or failed for you. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So at Sorcerer level 3, I'm now going to revisit Eyes of the Dark. And this is going to force us to set up the requirement of our 2 sorcery points. So here's what I want to do first. I want to find the darkness spell, because we now have the ability to cast that. So I'm going to first drop this onto our action sheet, and then I'm going to use this as our ability. So I'm going to move this into our sorcery points group. Now, I don't have sorcery points set up at this point, but that shouldn't be that big of an issue. So it's right here, sorcery points. I'm going to set this up to be a ability group. It's going to use our charisma. And because our character is level 3, we have 3 sorcery points. That gives us the ability to use this once, because it takes 2 sorcery points in order for us to be able to cast this without having to use a spell slot. Now I'm also then going to take this particular darkness spell again and drop it back into our spells group here so that it's there, because we also have the ability to cast this as a spell through our normal spell slots, which we have access to here. So you now have 2 ways to go about casting this particular spell. One that's linked to our sorcery points, one that's linked to your spell casting as you would normally cast it, and when you run out of sorcery points and you're in combat and action, the ability to use sorcery points goes away. So this can now piggyback off all of the other abilities that you gain through sorcery points. The last thing I want to go over is the darkness effect and how you can see through it in relation to utilizing your sorcery points. There isn't an easy way for you to set this up so that your own character can actually see through that particular darkness spell. However, the Dungeon Master can toggle that for you. When they add your token onto the map and you cast this particular spell in a specific area, they can add that ability for your character to see through it at the time that you have told them that you're using sorcery points. I'm not going to cover that here because I've already done that in a vision token video, I should say, which I will link in the description below. At Sorcerer level 6, your character will gain the Hound of Ill Omen feature that will allow you to summon a Hound of Ill Omen to your side or some location within 30 feet of where your character is currently standing. At the time of summoning, you must assign it a target, and its sole purpose in life is to close in on that target as direct a route as possible so that it can attack that target. This means it will move directly through objects versus going around them, and it can end its turn inside of another object, though it will suffer 5 points of force damage if it does that. And it moves through those objects as if they were difficult terrain, so half of their normal movement speed would be used. It will cost you 3 sorcery points to be able to summon this Hound, and when it is summoned, in addition to its normal hit points, it will have some extra temporary hit points that are equal to half of your sorcery level. So for example, at level 6, you would be able to add 3 temporary hit points to the total number of hit points that particular Hound has. There is one thing I want to point out about the Hound itself, and that is If you choose to designate a target that is hidden at the time that you summon the Hound or hides later on, that Hound is going to know exactly where that target is at the start of their turn because it has the means to sense it, and it's going to know its exact location. But this location is only going to be known to the Hound, not to your own character. Your character does not keep track of the Hound's location, so if it runs out of sight or out of range, your character is not going to know where it is, but you will still be able to disband it if you choose to do so. Another thing that I would like to point out is that you have to know about that target in order to summon the Hound against it. If a creature is invisible to you and no one in the party has detected it and pointed it out, or otherwise knows of its existence in order to inform the rest of the party, your character will not be able to summon the Hound and target that specific creature because you have no awareness of them. At the time that your character spawns the Hound, it will be shared to you by the DM over to your character. And I'm going to drag the DM screen over in a second to show you how that is going to work. And while there is a Hound of Ill Omen NPC sheet available to use, it's up to the DM if they want you to use that or not, or make use of the recommendation of simply modifying the direwolf stats in order to fit the Hound's needs. Now, in this particular case, here is the Hound, and you can actually see all of the stats that are here. But you as a player cannot drag this Hound into the combat tracker. Only the Dungeon Master can add content to this combat tracker. That's the reason why the Dungeon Master actually has to be the one to share this over. So when you go and actually summon the Hound, you're going to want to drag this into place. Specifically, you will want to drag, where is it? Figures. I'm going to have to go through and add this to our action sheet first. So I'm going to drop this into here because it will require sorcery points. So let me set this up as a group. This isn't going to be shadow magic. It's going to be sorcery points. So it's now going to fall into this particular group. And you can see that it automatically gained 3 uses. The problem is at level 6, we actually need 6 uses. So we just modify this to 6. Now we can summon this thing twice before we actually run out of sorcery points. And you'll see here that these sorcery points also got burnt through, which means you can only cast this darkness spell once now. But back to the initial task of sharing that information sheet over to the DM, you'll now want to drag this over and drop it into the chat window here. Just one sec. There we go. Now the Dungeon Master can pop this open. So I'm going to drag the Dungeon Master screen over to show you how this is going to work. So on the DM side of things, what's going to happen here is you're going to open up the Hound of Ill Omen. And if you need the module loaded, it will prompt you at that particular point in time. Once it's loaded, it will give you this information sheet. You will then drag and drop this into the actual combat tracker, and it's going to instantiate a Hound here. And you can go through and set it up so that it's friendly to the players, specifically to the player in question, and that it's visible. Once that is done, and only once that is done, will you click on this particular information sheet and then drag this over onto the actual character. And that's going to share this instance of that character, or creature rather, over to the actual character who's going to be using it. Now, back on the player side of things, this information sheet is going to pop open once the DM shares this particular creature with you. And it's going to be the creature that is directly linked to the combat tracker here. That's going to be linked in some form of way. Now, before you use this, you want to ensure that you add in your temporary hit points. But we haven't gone through and created any method for you to be able to do that. It's not part of this particular setup here. So it says here that you can add, where is it here? Yeah, it appears with a number of temporary hit points equal to half of your sorcerer level. So you're going to want to add another heal option here. And the way we want to set this up is it's going to be temporary hit points, and we want it to use half of your sorcerer level. So that's going to be 0.5. And then we scroll down until we get to SOR. Right there. And you'll see here that we have 9 temporary hit points, because I've already gone through and finished leveling this particular character up before I realized I forgot this step. Now all we have to do is open up the combat tracker here and drop the temporary hit points onto the Hound of Ill Omen, and it will now have the hit points you need. The problem is, you as the player are not going to be able to target the ape. You see how it's constantly setting the target to your character, not to the Shadow Hound, or the Hound of Ill Omen in this particular case? The DM still has to do things like that. So you're going to have to let the DM know that, hey, I want to target ape 3. There we go. So that's now the Hound's target. Once that Hound has its target set, you can execute the actual rolls. So let's say, for example, you wanted to make an attack. You will be able to do so when it's its turn, and you will see here that the Hound of Ill Omen executed an attack against Ape 3, and it hit. That means you can also roll its damage. Now, we've done some damage here. We also want to make sure that we execute the saving throw. So that you can simply drag and drop, or you can still do a roll because you have that targeted. In this case, they succeeded, so we don't get to knock them prone. Let's say that they failed. Clicking this isn't going to work. You're going to want to drag that effect into place. That's one of the few times where you'll absolutely have to drag something into place on a particular target. Now, I'm going to make a minor adjustment to Ape 3, make the next part of the demonstration a little bit easier. So, Ape 3 is almost dead. I'm going to have the Hound attack it again. Because it's currently prone, it's going to suffer a attack with disadvantage on it, or disadvantage in this particular case. But it still hit. So I'm going to do the damage. That has now killed Ape 3. The Hound of Ill Omen will now despawn because if its target is reduced to 0 hit points, it will disappear. Unlike other classes that also get to make use of the Hound of Ill Omen, this particular version of it forces it to disappear after that one target. So you can't have this Hound stick around and continue to help you out on the battlefield. You would have to resummon it in order for you to actually reassign it a brand new target. So you're going to want to assign this the toughest target on the campaign or on the map in order for you to be able to keep this creature around long enough to be able to help you. So at this particular point, the DM needs to delete the Hound, and you'll see that the information sheet has now gone away from your character. It is no longer shared to you because it's no longer within the combat tracker. At Sorcerer level 14, your character will gain the Shadow Walk feature that will allow your character to move between the shadows that are within dim light or in total darkness. As long as each shadow is within 120 feet of one another, your character can teleport from one to another as long as it also is in dim light or in darkness. This means you have to start your initial teleport from a point of dim light or a point of darkness, meaning you're standing in it, in order for this to work, as long as you can actually see the destination as to where you're going. There is no usage limitation to this, and this can effectively be used during combat or out in a non-combat based situation. It doesn't really much matter. When you're in combat, however, you would be able to jump from one shadow to another on each turn. So an example of that, let's say the party is roughly 120 feet out from your character. Let's increase that slightly, 130 feet out from your character. However, right next to your character within 5 feet of where you're standing is dim shadow, and approximately 120 feet away, within about 15 feet of where your party is that's currently engaged with a creature, there is another shadow. You could use this particular feature during that particular combat round by simply manually moving 5 feet into that shadow that's right next to you, teleport over to the other shadow that's 120 feet away from you, nearer and closer to the party, and then move the remaining distance to engage one or more creatures that might actually happen to be there. That's how you can effectively use this within a particular combat situation. Or if you're using this outside of a non-combat situation, you can literally just flit from one shadow to another and move at a speed of roughly 120 feet each turn. The final feature your character will acquire from the subclass is called Umbral Form, and this will happen at level 18. This feature allows your character to transform your character into a shadowy version of themselves by spending 6 sorcery points during a bonus action. In the process, they will gain resistances to all damage types except for radiance or force damage. Additionally, your character will be able to move through solid objects or creatures, but much like the Hound of Ill Omen, it's difficult terrain, and your character will suffer 5 points of force damage if you stop within that creature or that object, and end your turn there. These effects will last for 60 seconds or a total of 10 turns, but can be dismissed early by your own character, if your character happens to die, or they are otherwise incapacitated. So this is another feature that we're going to have to add into our character's action sheet here. Because A, there's a resistance effect that we have to apply, and there's the requirement of sorcery points, not shadow points, being used. So I'm going to drop this into place and simply move it down into our sorcery points group. That has now linked it so that we now have the required 6 sorcery points that we need in order to be able to use this. On top of that, I'm going to add the resistance effect. So I'm going to modify this, pop this open, and simply copy and paste an effect that I already have prepared. It's called Umbral Form, resist all in capital letters, and then the damage types that this character is going to be resistant to. Now, this particular list was copied from the Fantasy Grounds Wiki effects page, but I have removed the radiant and force damage from this list because your character is not going to be resistant to those 2 types of damage. This is also going to be against your character and will stick around for 1 minute. It doesn't expire outside of that 1 minute situation. So the way this is going to work is as follows. I've gone ahead and removed our quote-unquote spent sorcery points just for the purposes of this example. When your character is going to activate this feature, you first tick off 6 sorcery points. You then can drag this effect onto your character. You will also now have the ability to move around in this shadowy form. It will last for a total of 10 turns, and as long as you have this effect, you can continue to move through the battlefield in this shadowy form. At some point, if you choose to stop and you happen to be inside of a particular object, you must drag this damage onto your character so that you take that damage. This way, you have the ability to control that. The same thing could be said for the Hound of Ill Omen. If the Hound is on the battlefield, you drag and drop the damage there. That's the reason why that 5 force damage is there. Now, at this particular point, if your character is hit by any one of these types of damages, which I'm going to do here in a second, I'm going to give the vampire the turn. So let's say the things have moved forward. I'm going to go ahead and roll for my attack. I'm going to hit. Now I'm going to roll for my damage, and we should see a partially resistant indicator here. Excellent. That means this is working. After 10 turns, this umbral form will disappear. But we are now complete when it comes to setting up this particular character, and those sorcerers who use shadow magic have some pretty nice capabilities. But there's going to be a stigma, if you will, against a character who uses this particular subclass because of their ties to the Shadowfell. Now, if anyone has read any of the books within the Forgotten Realms series, you will know that it is possible to have that stigma overcome. There's a number of authors that have included a couple of creatures from the Shadowfell, and they've all sort of overcome that stench of the Shadowfell, if you will, in a certain way, shape, or form. But this gives you the ability as a player to go through and find a way to do that on your own, if that is your end desire. If not, and you want to remain in a position where people don't like you and you want to be able to use that as power against them, that's entirely up to you. And the first issue is that there will be physical differences that affect your character, or some subtle sign that others will pick up on and instantly distrust your character because they will have been identified as a shadow sorcerer and therefore potentially linked against the Shadowfell. The other stigma is around the shadow magic itself, as it will tend to make people think your character is not good, and they will distrust them because of that. But it can also be an interesting part of the campaign through socially breaking through those barriers. Now, if you're using Xanathar's Guide to Everything's extra customization capabilities, then you will also know that whenever your character casts magic, there's a bit of an effect that just kind of sits around for a little while. That's going to give other characters the clues that indicate you're from the Shadowfell, and that's the type of magic you're casting. Even if you as a player aren't using that particular customization, the DM is still going to potentially apply that kind of effect. However, this does bring us to the end of this particular video, and I hope you found it useful and informative, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. I wish to thank you for taking the time to watch this particular video. I hope you found it informative and useful to familiarizing yourself with Fantasy Grounds in general, and that you had fun in the process. If you found the video useful and you liked the content of the particular video, go ahead and click that like button to let me know. And if you have any questions specific to the topic covered by this particular video, or just have some comments in general, please feel free to post something in the comments section, and I will do my best to respond to any questions that are asked.
Additionally, I do release content quite regularly, and it's generally specific to Fantasy Grounds or 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons at this time. So if you'd like to be notified when new videos come out, go ahead and subscribe and click the notification bell to ensure that notification is sent to you when I release a new video.